This is 28th lecture of the course, and in this lecture we are going to discuss non-random sampling. As we know, or we will be coming to know, that normally we would be discussing the non-random sampling techniques, the random sampling techniques, and the complex sampling techniques. Today, in this lecture, we are going to discuss the non-random sampling. In many research problems, we find that the only option for the researcher is to decide, or the best option for the researcher is to decide himself or herself which members of the population, which items of the population should be included in the sample or not. That is the privilege of the researcher. In many cases where there are no list of persons, cannot be proper, suppose wife battering or widows, Maruti car owners, consumers of a particular type of detergent powder, alcoholics, or say drug addicts, students and teacher who frequently miss the classes, migrant workers, and of course so on. The probability sampling is difficult and inappropriate. In such researches, non-probability sampling is utilized. Non-random or non-probability sampling procedures do not use the rules of probability theory, do not claim very precise representativeness, and are usually used for qualitative and exploratory analysis. Members or population items is not possible, and so there cannot be a random sample. What does random means? Random means equal chance or equal opportunity to each of the members or each of the items of the sample of the population to be included in the sample. That is the random or probability sampling. That each and every member of the population has equal chance. If he is left, it is because of the chance, and if it is included in the sample, it is because of the chance. There is no decision with the researcher to include whom and not to include whom. Whereas in the non-random and non-probability sampling procedure, the researcher has high authority or authority to include or not to include a particular member or item of the population in the sample. However, this must be reminded that the researcher has to go in the selection of sample in this non-random procedure also with some logic. It's not that it is only his decision that matters, but his decision to include or not to include certain members or certain items of the population in the sample is to be taken on some logical basis. Then only the best results would come out of the sample. If he or she does not follow this, then of course it means that the researcher is not going to get an unbiased result. Anyway, we shall be discussing some of these techniques one by one. So, first we discuss the convenience sampling. What is convenience sampling? This type of sampling is also known as accidental or haphazard sampling. In this sampling, the researcher studies all those persons who are most conveniently available or who accidentally come in his contact during a certain period of time in the research. So, for example, the researcher engaged in the study of university students might visit the university canteen, library, some departments, playgrounds, verandas, and interview a certain number of students. So, here what we find that it is a convenience sampling, whoever is available becomes available, we or whether accidentally or by meeting them, we take him as a member of the sample. That is called the convenience sampling. And this has to be, there are many examples for that. Even if we are working on the Indian migrants who have come back after serving 30 or 40 years in the Gulf countries, their social and economic integration, then we can also adopt this method and we can go to them, or if some of them meet us accidentally, we can make them the member of the sample and collect data from them. That is called the convenience sampling. Then comes the purposive sampling. This is also known as judgment sampling. The researcher purposely chooses persons who in his judgment about some appropriate characteristics characteristics required for the sample members are thought to be relevant to the research topic and easily available to the researcher. So what do we mean by this? We mean that the researcher has to decide from his insight, from his literature survey, from his logic, whom will be better to be included in the sample. For example, suppose the researcher wants to study beggars. He knows that there are 3 areas where beggars are found in abundance. So, he visits only these 3 areas. That is, only these 3 areas are taken in the sample to collect, to interview beggars and to make the sample. So, suppose we are studying the beggars in a city, say in a legal city. So, there are some areas in which there will be hardly any beggar, and there are some areas where there is concentration of the beggars. So, suppose out of the municipal wards, which are perhaps 90, one has to collect the data about beggars. So, if the researcher, he or she goes to random sampling, then maybe in random sampling all those areas are chosen to be studied which have very little or no beggars. So, that would not serve the purpose. So, the researcher has to identify which of these areas, say he wants to study 5 areas. So, which of these 5 areas are in the city wards are mostly concentrated with beggars, and from his, say, knowledge, from his insight, rather from his knowledge, he chooses those 5 areas to make the sample of his study for collecting the data about the beggars. This is called the purposive sampling, because it has been done, the sample has been made for some purpose, and if a random sampling is followed, the purpose may not be served. So, this is called the purposive sampling. Next is the quota sampling. What is quota sampling? This is a version of stratified sampling which we shall be discussing in the complex sampling methods. The difference is that instead of dividing the population into a strata and randomly choosing the respondents, it works on quotas fixed by the researcher. So, this is why, since it is the decision of the researcher to fix the quota, this is why it is called the quota sampling. So, here is the example of studying, say, 50 MBA students from 150 students in 5 institutions. The researcher fixes the quota of 10 students from each institution, out of which 5 should be boys and 5 should be girls. That is the quota fixed by the researcher. Or suppose, and this is why it is quota sampling. Suppose the student is working on the satisfaction level of students from teaching at a university. So, a university has hundreds of department. So, in this department, what should be done to study the satisfaction of students? The researcher finalizes that, okay, 3 students from each of the departments would be taken into sample, and even their selection is not going to be random. He says that only toppers are to be included in the sample. So, suppose a department has 3 courses, then toppers of these 3 courses are to be included in the sample. So, here the sampling technique is called the quota sampling, where every department was fixed a quota to be included in the sample. And not only that, those who would be members of the sample, they are also declared that they would not be selected on the random basis. That is, any student of the department, 3 students of the department, no. They would be toppers of the department who would be included in the sample. So, as the researcher has distributed his sample or obtained his sample by assigning quota to each of the department, it is called the quota sampling. Quota, quota sampling. That is, certain quota has been, certain sub-size has been allotted to each of the department. And of course, those who would be into the sample, they are also, it is also going to be not random, but on some judgment basis which the researcher has decided. So, a quota sampling is where the quota is fixed by the researcher, not following any formula or something, but by his own judgment. Even in some bigger department, he can give bigger representation, and in a smaller departments, he can give a smaller representation, or he can give equal representation to all the department. This all depends upon the researcher's decision and his insights to collect the best sample for studying the problem that he has at hand or she has at hand. The next is the snowball sampling. What is that? In this technique, the researcher begins the research with a few respondents who are known and available to him. And subsequently, the respondents identify other names, provide other names who meet the criteria of research, and further these people give new names, and this way the chain goes and the process is continued until an adequate number of persons are interviewed or until no more respondents are discovered. That is the snowball sampling. Suppose we are working on Indian migrants from the GCC countries who have come back by working there for decades, and then you are studying, the research is studying their integration in the economy and society here. So, we can have the snowball sampling also. We know, say, a few persons who have come back from the returned back by staying for 2-3 decades in those countries and now struggling here to settle back in the economy and the society. So, we have suppose identified 5 of them. The researcher goes and meet them, interviews them. These 5 would identify some more. The researcher goes to them and collect the data. This group also again identifies some further people who have come back from the Gulf and again struggling the same way. So, that way it keeps on until unless the required number of the size of the sample is complete. Suppose if he requires say 200 respondents, so in that way in a snowball sampling he started with the researcher started with a few names with him, but then he was directed, he was some more people were some more such people were identified to him, he went to them. The other group also identified some more people, they went to him. This would continue until unless the size of sample, that is 200, is complete and the adequate numbers of persons have already been interviewed or data collected. So, then it would stop, or until more respondents are not to be found, the last group is unable to identify some more, then of course the data collection would stop. So, that is the snowball sampling. This is also, these samples are all, these methods are also very important and crucial in many kind of studies. Then the volunteer sampling. This is the technique in which the respondent himself volunteers to give information he holds. That is, the researcher say may advertise that he is going to study the satisfaction level of students from the teaching at the university, and many people would volunteer, many students would volunteer to give their responses, to give their feelings, to give their information about their satisfaction to the researcher. That is volunteer sampling. So, here the the, the members of the sample, they become like volunteers. There is a request, and on that request they come to volunteer the 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 information or the data that they have with themselves regarding the phenomena or the problem of research. That is the volunteer sampling. So these were a few types of sampling techniques through the non-probability method. However, the researcher should be very careful in such kind of researches, because the success of the research is dependent on the rich information given by respondents. But many times the leading informants selected by researchers are those who do not have much and appropriate information on the topic under study and who are unwilling to cooperate and respond. The researcher bias in selecting the leading subjects is evident in the following cases. The researcher has no knowledge or little knowledge of the social setting of the research. For example, the researcher who wants to study the informal social networks in the village or factory or a university, etc. So what he can do? He can depend on certain people who are basically not suited for collecting the data, and that way there would be biased. Further, the informants may not represent the population. The informants may not represent the population. That is, they do not have the aggregate or the characteristics in those characteristics which are in the population, because the members of the sample must carry the characteristics of the population also. So if they lack it, then of course it means that not appropriate sample has been made. Further, they are not typical in the sense that their observations and opinions may be misleading. The atypical or marginal informants within their group will not provide adequate information. That is the same thing, that the selection of the informants, the members in the sample must be very carefully done to arrive at an unbiased study, because it is all on the judgment of, on the insight and decision of the researcher. Further, there may be a lot of the people who may be unhelpful and uncooperative. There are activists in particular group because of which they do not present the viewpoints of the other groups, especially when we go for the studies on elections or the electoral studies or the studies on the say on the manifestos of the different parties, or if we go for the studies on the performance of certain parties. So here the researcher has to be very particular in choosing that those who make the sample, they do not represent a particular group, because then the findings, the sample becomes unbiased, and so the findings. Further, they should not belong to the community under investigation only marginally, and this marginality is bound to bias their views. So, it is the same thing which we have discussed earlier in the different context, that if we suppose we are studying the, say, perceptions or the satisfaction or the popularity, then also if suppose we are working on the popularity of a leader of a certain party, and then only those who make up the supporters of that party are included in the sample, then again the sample becomes biased sample, and the results obtained are also not correct. They would be biased. Selecting informants, one should select, the researcher should select the informants who are convenient for study. Further, personal leaning of the researcher of being prejudiced against certain types of persons, say untouchables, non-Hindus, non-Muslims, non-Christians, or shabbily dressed persons to fashionable women and so forth, that has also to be avoided. Because if suppose somebody is working on divorce and the researcher himself or herself is biased towards the fashionable women, then the sample he or she is going to make is not going to give unbiased results, because the sample itself was unrepresentative, because he had certain bias, certain kind of personal leanings against and prejudice against certain kind of women. So the research may not be appropriate and would not be giving the exact true picture of the phenomena. So the personal leaning or personal ideology of the researcher is also important. And as we have already discussed before, that a scientific pursuit of research requires that the researcher himself or herself is unprejudiced, is unfavorable to any, and has no bias against any. He or she treats equally all the ideas, all the ideologies. Rather, the researcher must be neutral, rather completely neutral, and very neutral in the very tough sense, that nothing influences his or her research. If he has some opinion in favor and against, or he is biased in favor or against, he is in favor of some or against, for some and against some, then the research is not going to give appropriate and true picture of the phenomena. In this, it was to say that in this kind of sampling, there are always chances that these things creep silently, not deliberately but undeliberately also, or even deliberately undeliberately in making the sample. So, this is why in these kind of sampling methods, the researcher must be very careful to for his to be very unbiased to make the sample from the population for which he has been given the to study. I am sure I have been able to clear you about the non-random sampling. Thank you very much.